Hi there, this is John Fairhurst with my review of Paul Anderson's The Time Patrol. In terms of genre, the stories in this collection relate to that staple of science fiction, time travel, and all the stories involve one Mance Everard, usually in a fairly major role, but occasionally just as a walk-on role. There are 9 stories within this collection, including at least one that has been published separately as a novella. This collection, as published, was published in 1991. The stories themselves are Time Patrol, Brave to be a King, Gibraltar Falls, The Only Game in Town, Delenda Est, Ivory and Apes and Peacocks, The Sorrow of Odin the Goth, Star of the Sea, and The Year of the Ransom. There are other fuller versions of this book that have one or other of the following 2 stories. The Shield of Time, which I have read as a separate story but won't cover here, and Death and the Night, which I haven't read at all. The full list and the dates of publications of the stories will be listed in the description box below. The stories are loosely arranged chronologically in Everard's personal timeline, in so much as this has any meaning in the circumstances. The first story, Time Patrol, introduces us to a Mance Everard who is yet to hear of the Time Patrol. Excuse me. From the story, it looks like it's set pretty soon after the Second World War or the early 50s, and Poul Anderson sounds as if he's anticipating a period of depression as America stops spending money on fighting the Axis, not foreseeing the developing Cold War with the Soviet Union. Everard himself is an engineer with an impressive combat record, and he's looking for a new job in the small ads of the papers. When he finds one advertising just the bare minimum of information to pique his interest, he goes for an interview. There's quite a bit of banter between Everard and his interviewer, who went by the name of Mr. Gordon, though Everard doubts that's actually his name. Everard soon finds himself back in the far distant past, along with people from all eras of humanity. But it's Charles Whitcomb from the rather grim England of 1947 with whom he finds most in common. And after graduation on his return to 1950s America, it's Whitcomb he contacts when he finds something fishy in a newspaper article about the excavation of an ancient barrow in southeast England. This involves a trip to both Victorian London and to Jutish Essex. For the only time in these stories, we get to meet a literary character, a certain great detective, though due to copyright concerns he isn't named. With this being the first story in the series, it's likely Anderson wasn't sure of some of the elements that would form the backbone of the rest of the stories, particularly how important the near-godlike Denalians would be. This is basically the only story we meet them in, and they are suitably godlike. It's probably the most light-hearted of the stories in my opinion, and I particularly like this story due to the way Everard found his job in the small ads. So always keep your eye on them. After the events of the earlier story, Mance has been promoted to the rank of unattached patrolman, basically making him a transtemporal troubleshooter, allowed, nay encouraged, to use his own judgment to solve the problems inherent in travellers going rogue in the past. But in Brave to be a King, when Cynthia Dennison turns up at his 20th century New York apartment, his skills would be put to a severe test. Cynthia was an old flame, but had ended up marrying Keith Dennison, another member of the patrol, though in his case he was an investigator living in ancient Iran, studying the past that the patrol was set up to protect. This time Mance is operating largely on his own. The era in which Dennison has gone missing was a turbulent one, so what else is new? When the Persians were getting restive under the rule of their Median overlords, and it was the reason for Dennison's visit. Mance came to that time period about 16 years after the revolution that had overturned the empire, hoping to find rumours about what had happened to his old friend. Acting as the Greek traveller Meander, Mance attaches himself to the court of the exiled King Croesus, where he can learn the history of the previous few decades without attracting too much attention. It's here that Mance learns of the near miraculous beginnings of Sirius's reign, but nothing of a stranger 16 years ago. But Croesus says he'll ask around court for Meander. Surely the arrival of a patrol requesting Meander's presence to meet the Grand Vizier of the Empire, who wants to know why Mance is looking for this traveller, is pure coincidence. No? And it is clear to Mance there's something deeper going on here. All is made clearer when the king arrives in his full pomp and instantly recognisable, despite 16 years of hard campaigning since Mance had last seen Keith. Over the rest of the story, Mance and Keith work out ways of getting Keith out of his situation with minimal damage to the timeline, though Keith does wonder at times whether he really wants to return to his original time. They eventually work out a plan where they'd go back to the very beginnings of the Sirius mysteries and stop the murder of a baby. But how will Keith adapt back to life in the 20th century, and can he still love Cynthia after his Persian wives? But that's where this story ends. The next story, Gibraltar Falls, is a particularly provocative title for a Brit, but it relates to the collapse of the land barrier between what would become the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. This story is unusual to this collection in that Mance Everard is barely present, the tale being told largely from the point of view of Tom Nomura and Félix Arash, the former effectively being a contemporary of Everard, while the latter was a citizen of a matriarchy from a companion's far future. Félix wasn't a scientist doing scientific research, but an artist taking recordings of the event, and a risk taker, which is where the meat of the story occurs, when she gets a touch too close to the scene when he's caught up in the maelstrom. Tom is more than a little in love with the artist and does the forbidden, looping back in time after time, until he finds a way to pick up from catastrophe. Of course, this is completely contrary to patrol policy, but the patrol has a certain latitude, and Mance Everard, as an unattached agent, has immense power and suggested a solution. Although very short indeed, it's a very lyrical piece, especially for these time travel stories. The Only Game in Town rather subverts the main theme of the Time Patrol. Its mission has always been presented as making sure that the timeline is maintained, but in this tale, John Sandoval has been tasked with an intervention in 13th century America and wants Mance to tag along. Only this time there's no evidence of temporal interference. While undertaking the study of the First Nations tribes up near the Crater Lake, Sandoval found himself facing a Mongol horde. He's had the patrol investigate, and they could not find any record of the expedition being more than a legitimate exploration party. It's not even that surprising there were no records from a certain Venetian explorer who was visiting China around the same time. After all, the expedition is a long way from home and accidents happen. Mance is still wondering why he was being asked to get involved when Sandoval informs him that this isn't a spy mission, but one that's intended to arrange that accident that stopped the Mongols from getting home, and the instructions came from them to Denelian headquarters, so no arguing about them. Both Sandoval and Mance reckon that this is going to be an easy mission. After all, these are unsophisticated people, only a couple of generations away from having the same sort of nomadic lifestyle as the native tribes that they were passing through. But the patrolmen had miscalculated and quickly found themselves prisoners of the Mongols, and Sandoval suffering a bad head injury. Mance manages to turn the tribes on his captors and makes a break for it, knowing he can get away with bending the temporal rules to rescue Sandoval. The tone of this story is a bit more cynical than these tales usually are, particularly for ones written at this period in Anderson's life, and more direct action action orientated than the majority as well. Okay. Delenda Est is a fairly unusual story as far as these time patrol stories are concerned. Although it is a time travel story, the main action in the tale is more of a changed history story. Mans and his colleague Piet van Sarawak, Dutch-Indonesian Venetian from the 24th century and henceforward known as Sarawak, have got bored with the hunting available in the Pleistocene. I know, shocking, isn't it? And decide New York 1960 would be sufficiently decadent. So the pair arranged to transfer to an unsuspecting New York City. Only when their hopper passes through the time to its pre-programmed time and location, the two men are stunned to find themselves in an open street rather than in a hidden warehouse. The locals are equally surprised, almost as surprised rather, for they act quicker and quickly subdue the patrolmen even as they begin to act. When the patrolmen recover, the couple find themselves in jail, and when Mans and Sarawak go through the standard list of languages, they find that the Germanic languages have the closest recognition rates, though are still incomprehensible. The usual go-to lingua franca, Latin, was not recognised at all by the local police, and when a language specialist was called in, she was able to find her store of ancient Greek the most understandable. Mans tried to put playing the gods from outer space routine here, but these people may not have been much more than an empirical knowledge of science. Steam cars were a thing, but not petrol-driven vehicles. But they aren't the ignorant savages their Celtic roots would have someone of our background thinking of them as. Plus, they've also been in a recent series of wars that have produced a degree of desperation in their leaders to find a way of returning to the top spot, or even surviving. While Sarawak and Mans are working on their captors, the house where they are being held is raided by one of the powers their current hosts are most worried about. And when the two patrolmen find themselves exchanging captors, though this time they are joined by their translator. These captors aren't quite as careful of their new acquisitions, and the patrolmen manage to escape, though they still have their translator with them. She was very beautiful and useful in identifying the breakpoint between the two histories. After that, it's just a matter of putting together a squad to put everything back onto the correct track. And what to do with Deirdre's translator? Hint, Mans doesn't get the girl yet again. A bit of a running theme in these tales. This story was one of my favourites, and whilst it's still fun, the story has become a bit stale, though hopefully it will improve again after a rest. In Ivory and Apes and Peacocks, the story opens with Man Severard sailing into the port of Tyre, now in the modern country of Lebanon, during the reign of King Hiram, to answer to the call for help from the patrol agents in place in this important ancient crossroads, though not as important or well supported as Jerusalem a few centuries later and a few miles south. Apparently, a group of criminals from the far future agrees with the agents in place, and it's as he is approaching the house of the agents, along with his local guide, who provides a lot of the fun in this story, that we have the first interaction between the criminals and the patrol, when a blind beggar proves not to be blind, a beggar, or indeed a local, as he shoots Mans with a sonic stunner. Mans would have been jelly if his guide hadn't proven to be adept with his sling. As Mans recovers in the house of Zakabal, in reality the patrol agent Chaim Zorak and his wife Yale, Chaim and Yale fill him in on why they and clearly the criminal gang believe Tyre to be such an important target. This was reasonably interesting, though rather a filler into the main story. This main story becomes a detective story as Mance has to find anyone who has memories of strangers passing through Uzu, which is the former capital, a generation earlier. He is aided by his guide Primarian, who guided that Mance was someone worth being around, and it's the youngster who provides the access to the servants that gives Mance his break. Pam is a great character and allows Anderson to show his belief that ignorance isn't stupid. There's also a bit of the current history mentioned in the use of Kime and Yael that may not be such an issue now, but overall it's a delightful little tale. Next up is The Sorrow of Odin the Goth, which sees us travelling back to the disturbed times of the Hunnish invaders as they push the Goths in towards the Roman borders. It also covers the introduction of Christianity to the Goths, but the main story is told from the point of view of Karl, who is investigating the tales of the Germanic Eddas and their version of Odin, which involves him in meeting with the various Gothic tribes. And while it wasn't entirely coincidence that Karl looks like the popular view of Odin, he hasn't really thought through what effect this would have on the locals or himself. Karl finds himself attracted to the daughter of a local chief to the extent that they are married and that they set up home together, no doubt aided by his apparently mystical background and the gifts he'd lavished on the family. Unlike the earlier stories, this tale is set along a series of dates through a near century of the continuous timeline experienced by the Gothic tribe he was following. Mance Everard doesn't really get a look in during this story, just appearing every now and then to force Karl through various crises of conscience when the realisation of what he got himself and his descendants into during those turbulent times overwhelms him, and in ensuring that the timeline doesn't get too tangled. When I first read this, I wasn't too enthusiastic about this story, mainly because of the way Karl jumps about in the timelines, including a few jumps to the 1930s where Karl and Laurie, his real wife, had set up home, both are later 20th century born. This time through, I quite enjoyed it, though Anderson's inclusion of the comments about the corporatization of the latter half of 20th century American culture and his apparent blaming of this on the Democrats rings rather hollow these days. The next story, Star of the Sea, is also set on the borders of the Roman Empire, though more than 300 years before, and on the northern borders, North European borders in Germany and the Low Countries, as those borders were being formalised. For the first time in Mance's career that we have been allowed to see, his official partner is a female agent. Jan Floris, like Karl from our previous review, is a cultural investigator, though working more directly with the tribes and legions interacting along the northern borders. This time, the team's concern isn't any obvious threat to the timeline, just a couple of versions of Tacitus's histories. This part is handled quite nicely, in my opinion. We have Everard discussing Tacitus's histories and why they are important to history, then passing the info dump off as an explanation of basic patrol processes to one of those whose job it was to do the data collection. Anyway, a research team working a couple of hundred years after Jan's era wanted to get Tacitus's take on their area of study, so they raided a local private library to take a copy of those histories, only to find out that it had a major difference to the patrol reference copy. Instead of the Batavian rebellion giving the Romans a scare but ultimately petering out, it was much more successful to start with, but much more violently eliminated in the end, with a key change being that the Ceres Valida, suing for peace in Tacitus I and for war in Tacitus II. Mance spends quite a while in this tale grouching about intrusive government, but once he gets over that, he and Jan travel back to the 30 ADs to investigate which version of Tacitus is correct and make sure it's Tacitus I. And apologies for messing these pronunciations up. We get a bit of an introduction to the principal characters from the Germanic tribes side of the adventure. Waled and her companion Idhim, as they discuss their way forward. And it's the man who's pushing for more violence. As Mance and Jan start interacting with these characters, they find themselves travelling further north and deeper into the past until they came to the source of the disruption. In between, we get to see some of the brutality Anderson imagines both sides inflicted on each other during this conflict, and probably about right, or maybe even worse than he says. When the two patrol members find their way back to Heidheim and Waled's earliest days, they're in the Danish islands on the Baltic coast, where they are forced to watch Waled's first meeting with Romans, and it wasn't awfully pleasant. And Jan, being less used to the messy reality than Mance, used the technology on the time scooter to destroy the marauding sailors, and the young Ed took her as the vengeful aspect of her goddess, and her companion swears eternal vengeance on the Romans. In order to mitigate the effects this has on the couple, Jan and Mance travel back to the Waled, who was having doubts about what she was doing. Her companion did not want to make peace, even though she did by this point, and killed himself rather than break oath. Again, Mance doesn't get to be more than a temporary companion to his lady friend, and I have to say that this was the hardest story to get through, though this could have been because it was so thematically similar to the previous story. In The Year of the Ransom, we open on the Galapagos Islands in the present, where we see the actions from the first-person point of view of Wanda Tamberley, who's a guide on the islands and has no idea of the time patrol or the possibilities of time travel, until a stranger appears atop a machine hanging in midair, demanding to know if she's Wanda Tamberley. Almost without thought, she admits that she is, and finds herself swept off into a fantastical adventure. We then cut back to the early 1500s and the treasury holding the ransom for the Inca, where a further delivery is being overseen by Luis Ildefonso Castelar y Moreno, hereafter known as Castelar, both in the story and here, and Fray Esteban Tanakil, Franciscan friar, otherwise known as Stephen Tamberley of the Time Patrol. Castelar was just being curious, but under the guise of de-heathenizing the ransom, Tamberley is making records of these treasures lost to history when the Spanish melted the loot down for ease of transport. Both get taken by surprise by an incursion into the vault from a more aggressive set of time travellers, who take both men away with them as they made their escape. It became clear that Farrar Tanakil was not what he said he was, and they turned all their attention on him, not thinking Castelar a threat. Oh boy, were they wrong. Far future supermen fell to enraged conquistador, and those who could fled the scene, leaving Castelar in charge of an abandoned time machine. Tamberley is too ill from his interrogation to do much more than go along with Castelar and show him how it worked, before being abandoned in turn, as Castelar goes off in search of glory both for himself and the Spanish crown. His first stop is to pick up Wanda to get her to show him her wonderful world. Given that this was Wanda's first contact with time travel as well, she keeps ahead reasonably well. Though to be fair, she's also already been contacted by Mance as he searched for the missing Tamberley. Together, late 20th century girl and grizzled time agent managed to overcome the displaced Castelar. But what about Uncle Stephen? Well, lost in time by Castelar, who knows where, or when, rather. He's pretty much been abandoned, but he's taken his own steps to being recovered. And this time, Mance keeps to keep the girl. Overall, this is a great collection of stories and gives gives you a good selection of Poul Anderson's style. And I like most of them, especially the first one, The Way Mance Gets Recruited. In my opinion, the two Roman stories are the most boring, though the Sorrow of Odin the Goth was rather more interesting this time through. If you've read any of these stories and have a particular favourite, or one you don't particularly like, please comment in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. The Amazon links in the description below will allow you to purchase a slightly different version of the collection, which appears to have Death in the Night as the additional story, along with much better cover art. Like all such affiliate links, I get a percentage of the sale price with no additional cost to you. Thanks for listening, or even watching. Goodbye.